The richest rancher's daughter married the poorest ex-convict, lost everything, lived in poverty while the town mocked them. Then came the revelation that changed Arizona territory forever. He wasn't an outlaw by choice. He was a kidnapped millionaire's son. This is their incredible, true story.
Hello. If you believe every underdog deserves to be seen and lifted up, your support means more than you know. Hitting 1,000 subscribers isn't just a number for us, it's what allows these real, hopeful stories to reach people who might desperately need them to stay motivated.
The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty main street of Prescott as Ruthie Winters stood outside the Yavapai County Courthouse, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small carpet bag containing everything she now owned in the world. At 24 years old, with her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and her best Sunday dress already showing dust from the long walk into town, she cut a solitary figure on the wooden boardwalk. Behind her, through the courthouse windows, she could still hear her father's voice, cold, final, absolute in its condemnation. You walk out that door with that convict, Ruthie, and you're no daughter of mine. Not one cent of Winter's money will ever touch your hands. You'll be dead to this family, dead to decent society. Ruthie was known throughout Prescott as Silas Winter's peculiar daughter, the one who read too many books, who questioned too much, who never quite fit the mold of what a wealthy rancher's daughter should be. Her mother had died bringing her younger brother into the world when Ruthie was 12, and her father had never quite forgiven her for surviving when his wife had not. Her two older brothers, Clayton and Harrison, had inherited their father's hardness and his contempt for anything that didn't directly increase the family's wealth or standing. Now, as she waited on that sun-scorched boardwalk, watching the curious and judgmental faces of townspeople passing by, some openly staring, others whispering behind gloved hands, Ruthie felt the weight of the choice she was about to make. A choice that would strip away every comfort, every security, every social connection she had ever known. Inside the courthouse, Japheth Lutherman was signing the final papers of his parole release. 3 years in Yuma Territorial Prison for his role in a stagecoach robbery. 3 years that had transformed him from a hardened outlaw into a man desperately seeking redemption for sins he could barely remember choosing. At 29 years old, his face bore the weathered marks of a life lived hard and fast, but his eyes held something different now, something that looked almost like hope. Hello, my dear friend. This is Cordelia Ashford, your narrator of Frontier Tales. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from. A warm greeting to you all, and I hope you find inspiration in this story. The courthouse door opened, and Japheth emerged, squinting in the bright sunlight. His belongings consisted of the clothes on his back, $43 in wages from his prison labor, and a battered Bible given to him by the prison chaplain, the man who had taught him to read during those long, dark years behind bars. When his eyes found Ruthie standing there, waiting for him as she had promised in her weekly letters throughout his imprisonment, something cracked in his carefully maintained composure. "You came," he said, his voice rough with emotion he struggled to contain. "I gave you my word," Ruthie responded, stepping forward and taking his calloused hand in hers, not caring who saw, not caring about the scandalized gasp from Mrs. Abigail Hartford and her daughter Coraline across the street. "I've given you my heart, Japheth. The rest doesn't matter." But neither of them noticed the well-dressed man observing them from the shadows of the territorial building across the street. Detective Thurston Wade of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been searching for Japheth Lutherman for over 3 years, and now, finally, his long investigation was about to bear fruit. The truth he carried would transform everything this young couple thought they knew about their future, their past, and the extraordinary destiny awaiting them in the unforgiving Arizona territory. The weeks following Japheth's release were marked by a harsh education in how deeply prejudice could cut. Ruthie had anticipated difficulty, but the reality exceeded even her darkest expectations. When they attempted to purchase supplies at the general store, the owner, a man who had served her family for 20 years, refused them service outright. "No convicts in my establishment," he declared, arms crossed over his substantial belly. and no women foolish enough to tie themselves to such men, neither. Ruthie felt her face burn with humiliation, but Japheth's hand on her arm steadied her. "Come on," he said quietly. "There are other stores." But there weren't, not really. One by one, the merchants of Prescott closed their doors to them. Credit was denied, even when they had cash in hand. Employment opportunities vanished when Japheth's name was mentioned. They survived on odd jobs from Mexican ranchers outside town who cared less about a man's past than his ability to work, and on the meager income Ruthie earned taking and sewing from the very women who refused to speak to her in public. 6 weeks after his release, they married in the small Methodist chapel on the edge of town. Ruthie arrived in a borrowed wagon, wearing a simple gray dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd purchased in the neighboring settlement of Chino Valley. As she approached the chapel, her heart sank. Her father stood blocking the entrance, flanked by her brothers Clayton and Harrison, and a small crowd of prominent townspeople. "This is your last chance, girl," Silas declared, his weathered face hard as Arizona granite. "I've arranged a respectable match for you with Theodore Bancroft's eldest son in Flagstaff. He's willing to overlook this temporary insanity. But you marry this outlaw, this convict, and you're choosing poverty, shame, and a life of being spit on by every decent person in the territory." Coraline Hartford, once Ruthie's closest friend, stepped forward with theatrical concern. "Ruthie, dear, think of your future children. Do you want them growing up with an outlaw's blood? With a father who's robbed innocent people?" The small crowd murmured agreement. Ruthie felt the crushing weight of their collective judgment, the future they were describing stretching before her like a barren desert. But then she looked past them and saw Japheth standing in the chapel doorway. This man who had worked himself to exhaustion in her father's stables for 2 years before his arrest, who had never once made an improper advance, who read his Bible by candlelight and spoke humbly of becoming worthy of a second chance. Her resolve hardened into steel. "Japheth has paid his debt to society," Ruthie said clearly, her voice carrying across the dusty churchyard. "He's worked honestly, lived honorably, and treated me with more respect than any so-called gentleman in this town. I'd rather have a lifetime of poverty with a good man than a mansion full of gold with a respectable coward." 3 years passed like a slow drought across the Arizona territory. Ruthie and Japheth built their life 20 miles outside Prescott on a small homestead they'd purchased with Japheth's prison wages and what little Ruthie had saved. The land was hard and unforgiving, the cabin modest with only 2 rooms and a leaking roof that Japheth repaired constantly. He worked odd jobs, breaking horses, mending fences, doing ranch work for anyone willing to hire a former convict. Ruthie took in sewing, sold preserves at the market in Chino Valley, and taught reading to minors' children for pennies. They had been spit on in Prescott streets, refused service even when they had money to pay, and had their credit denied at every mercantile. But their love had only deepened through the suffering, forged in the fire of shared hardship into something unbreakable. One scorching July afternoon, as Ruthie hung laundry on the line and Japheth repaired their perpetually leaking roof, a well-dressed man on a fine bay horse approached their property. He introduced himself as Detective Thurston Wade of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and asked to speak with them about an urgent matter concerning Japheth's past. Inside their modest cabin, Wade spread documents across their rough-hewn table, faded photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, legal papers, and letters written in a child's careful hand. "Mr. Lutherman, do you remember anything before you were with the Ketchum gang?" Wade asked carefully, watching Japheth's face. Japheth frowned, his hand instinctively reaching for Ruthie's. "I've told anyone who'd listen. I don't remember much before I was 7 or 8. The gang said they found me wandering near a burned wagon train outside Socorro, New Mexico. Said my family was dead. They raised me as one of their own." The pain in his voice was evident. This blank space in his past had haunted him throughout his imprisonment and beyond. Wade slid a photograph across the table. It showed a wealthy San Francisco family, a distinguished gentleman in formal attire, an elegant woman in silk, and a young boy of about 7 with dark curly hair and eyes that, Ruthie's breath caught, looked exactly like Japheth's. That's not a burned wagon train story, Mr. Lutherman. That's a kidnapping, Wade said quietly. You are Japheth Samuel Lutherman III, son of railroad magnate Japheth Lutherman II and his wife Virginia Calhoun Lutherman of San Francisco. You were kidnapped from your family's private train car during a stop in Deming, New Mexico, in June of 1862. You were 7 years old. The room seemed to tilt. Ruthie gripped Japheth's hand tighter as Wade continued, his voice gentle but relentless with facts that shattered everything they thought they knew. The Ketchum gang took you, likely planning to ransom you. But something went wrong, possibly your father's initial refusal to negotiate with criminals on principle. By the time he changed his mind, the gang had moved on, and you'd been absorbed into their life. Your parents searched for 15 years. Your mother died of grief in 1871. Your father passed away last year, still believing you were dead. Wade pulled out more legal documents, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. You are the sole surviving heir to the Lutherman estate. Your father never remarried, never had other children. Everything he built, the railroad shares, the Nevada silver mines, the San Francisco properties, the shipping investments, it's all yours. We're talking about an estate valued at approximately $800,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Ruthie felt Japheth's entire body trembling beside her. I was kidnapped, Japheth whispered, the revelation breaking something open inside him. I wasn't born to that life. They took me. They made me into, his voice cracked. Everything I did, all those robberies, the violence. I was just a child trying to survive in the only world I knew. Ruthie pulled him close as tears streamed down his weathered face. 3 years of poverty, of being spit on and rejected, of proving their worth through backbreaking labor. And now this. The man society had written off as irredeemable was actually the stolen son of one of California's most prominent families. Wade cleared his throat respectfully. There's a legal process, of course. You'll need to travel to San Francisco, provide testimony, undergo verification. But Mr. Lutherman, Mrs. Lutherman, your lives are about to change in ways you cannot imagine. But what neither Wade nor the couple could predict was how this revelation would transform not just their circumstances, but the entire social fabric of Prescott, Arizona territory, and how Ruthie and Japheth would choose to use their recovered fortune in ways that would challenge everything the territory believed about redemption, justice, and second chances. Thank you for journeying with us this far into Ruthie and Japheth's extraordinary story. If you're moved by how love and loyalty can triumph over the harshest judgment, if you believe that people deserve to be valued for who they're becoming rather than condemned for who they were, then this channel is for you. Ruthie chose to see worth where others saw only shame, and that choice changed everything. Subscribe now to hear how their story unfolds, how the outcasts become the most powerful voices for change in the territory, and how true nobility proves itself through character, not circumstance. For months later, after legal proceedings in San Francisco had confirmed Japheth's identity beyond any doubt, the couple returned to Prescott. But they didn't arrive quietly in a borrowed wagon as they'd left. They came in a private railroad car, accompanied by Detective Wade, a team of lawyers, and trunks full of fine clothes they still felt uncomfortable wearing. News had already reached Prescott through telegraph and newspapers. The sensational story of the outlaw who turned out to be a railroad heir had captivated the entire Southwest. When Japheth and Ruthie stepped off the train at the Prescott depot, a crowd had gathered. Not to spit on them this time, but to stare in wonder and whisper in awe at this impossible reversal of fortune. The very people who had refused them service, who had crossed streets to avoid them, who had called them trash and worse, now jostled for position, hoping to be noticed. Silas Winters stood at the front, his weathered face a complicated mixture of shock, calculation, and something that might have been shame. Clayton and Harrison flanked him, their expressions showing naked greed and desperate hope for reconciliation. "Ruthie," Silas began, stepping forward with arms tentatively extended. "Daughter, I've been thinking I may have been too harsh. Family is family, after all, and perhaps we can." Stop. Ruthie's voice cut through his words like a blade through silk. 3 years of poverty had taught her exactly how much her father's approval was worth. You made your position crystal clear 3 years ago. I was dead and buried to the Winters family. Those were your exact words, Father. The crowd had gone silent, sensing the drama unfolding before them. Silas's face reddened. Now, girl, you can't expect. You were marrying a convict. How was I to know he was actually? You were to know, Japheth interrupted, his voice calm, but carrying an authority it had never possessed before. Because your daughter told you. She told you I was a good man, working to redeem myself. She told you I treated her with honor. She told you that circumstances don't define character. You chose not to believe her. Coraline Hartford pushed forward from the crowd, her face arranged in an ingratiating smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ruthie, dearest friend, we've missed you so terribly. You simply must come to dinner. I've been telling everyone how we were always so close, how I always knew you had a special destiny. Ruthie's laugh was short and bitter. You told me my children would be cursed with outlaw blood, Coraline. You refused to attend my wedding. You crossed the street to avoid speaking to me in town. She paused, letting the weight of those memories settle over the crowd. I remember everything, every kindness and every cruelty. The silence stretched painfully until Japheth squeezed Ruthie's hand. She took a deep breath, and something shifted in her expression. The hardness softened, replaced by something deeper, not forgiveness earned, but grace freely given. However, Ruthie continued, addressing the entire crowd now. Japheth and I didn't return to Prescott for revenge or to settle scores. We came to make an announcement that we hope will change lives in this territory. Japheth stepped forward, pulling a document from his coat. We're establishing the Luther Man's Second Chance Foundation, headquartered right here in Prescott. We're funding a rehabilitation program for former convicts, job training, literacy education, housing assistance. We're also creating a legal aid fund for those who can't afford defense attorneys, because I know firsthand how poverty makes justice nearly impossible. The crowd murmured in astonishment. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Ruthie continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Additionally, we're purchasing the old Henderson property outside town to establish a home for women and children who've been abandoned or disgraced by their families. Because I know exactly what it's like to be cast out for making a choice others disapprove of. Some faces in the crowd showed genuine approval. Others continued their judgment, but all registered shock at this unexpected turn. As for you, Father, Ruthie said, turning to Silas, her voice softer now but still firm as iron, I don't hate you. I've learned that hate only poisons the one who carries it. But I do pity you. You traded your daughter for your pride, and you lost 3 years you can never recover. The door to reconciliation isn't closed, but it's not wide open either. You'll have to prove through actions, not words, that you've changed, that you can value people over appearances and profit. Silas's face crumpled slightly, the weight of his choices finally settling on his shoulders. Japheth addressed the crowd one final time. We know what people are saying, that we're fools to waste our fortune on criminals and outcasts. But we believe something different. We believe that one mistake shouldn't define an entire life. We believe that circumstances don't determine worth. And we believe that the measure of a society isn't how it treats its most successful citizens, but how it treats those who've fallen and are trying to rise again. He paused, looking around at the faces of people who had once judged him irredeemable. 3 years ago, this town decided I was beyond redemption. Only one person disagreed, the woman standing beside me. She saw something in me worth saving, worth believing in. Now we're going to offer that same chance to others whose society has written off. As they walked through the parted crowd toward their waiting carriage, Ruthie noticed a young man at the edge, weathered, anxious, wearing clothes that mark him as recently released from prison. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face the same desperate hope she'd once seen in Japheth's. She smiled at him, a genuine smile of recognition and promise. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in her life, Ruthie Winters Lutherman knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. 6 months after their return, the Foundation's first major test arrived like a summer storm. A young man named Jesse Callahan, barely 21, stood trial for horse theft, a hanging offense in Arizona territory. He was guilty, caught red-handed with the stolen mount. But Ruthie had met his widowed mother, Clara, had learned his story. A boy trying desperately to save his family's failing homestead after his father's death from typhoid, making one terrible, desperate choice. The prosecutor was Clayton Winters, Ruthie's eldest brother, now the territorial district attorney. He was pushing aggressively for the maximum sentence, death by hanging, partly for political advancement, partly to prove he wasn't influenced by his sister's soft-hearted nonsense about redemption. Ruthie and Japheth sat in the packed courtroom every single day of the trial. Their presence was noted by everyone, the reformed outlaw and his wife, now among the wealthiest and most discussed people in the territory, publicly supporting a horse thief. The newspapers had a field day with it. On the final day, before the jury deliberated, Judge Artemis Crawford made an unusual allowance. "Mr. Lutherman, I understand you wish to address the court. As a prominent citizen with unique perspective on these matters, I'll permit it." Japheth stood, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. He no longer looked like the desperate man who'd emerged from Yuma prison. He was dressed in fine clothes now, his bearing confident, but his eyes still carried the weight of his past, and that weight gave his words power. "Your Honor, gentlemen of the jury, I stand before you as living proof that one mistake doesn't have to define an entire life," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I committed crimes far worse than Jesse Callahan's. I rode with the Ketchum gang. I participated in robberies that terrorized innocent people. I was, by every legal and moral measure, a dangerous criminal." Clayton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly annoyed that his case was being undermined. "But here's what I learned in 3 years at Yuma, and in the years since. Punishment alone doesn't create redemption. It was the people who believed I could be more than my worst choices, starting with my wife, who saw something in me worth saving when no one else did. That gave me the strength to change." Japheth paused, letting his words settle over the room. "Jesse Callahan made a terrible choice. He should face consequences. I'm not arguing otherwise. But does he deserve to hang for one desperate act? Does his mother deserve to lose her only remaining family? Or do we, as a society, have the courage to believe that people can change?" The silence was profound. Several jurors looked visibly moved. "The Ketchum gang stole my childhood, my identity, my chance to know my real parents," Japheth continued, his voice roughening with emotion. "But even after all that, even after the crimes I committed because of it, I was given a second chance. I'm standing here today asking you to give Jesse Callahan the same opportunity one received, the chance to prove he's more than his worst moment." The jury deliberated for 6 agonizing hours. When they returned, the foreman stood solemnly. "We find the defendant guilty of horse theft, but we unanimously recommend mercy." Judge Crawford nodded slowly. "Jesse Callahan, I sentence you to 2 years in Yuma Territorial Prison, with the condition that upon release, you will work for the Lutherman Second Chance Foundation for 1 year, learning a trade and proving your commitment to honest living." Clara Callahan collapsed in her seat, weeping with relief. Her son would live. Clayton stormed out of the courtroom, his face red with fury at the verdict. But later that night, he appeared at the hotel where Japheth and Ruthie were staying. His expression was conflicted, angry, defensive, but also thoughtful. "I don't understand you too," he said without preamble, his voice tight. "You could have come back here and crushed everyone who ever wronged you. You have the money, the influence, the social position now. Father disowned you. I called you a fool to your face. This whole town spit on you. Why waste your power on criminals and outcasts? Why not make them pay?" Ruthie studied her brother, really looked at him, and saw past his bluster to the insecurity underneath, the man terrified of appearing weak. "Because we were criminals and outcasts, Clayton. We know what it's like to be judged only by your past, never given credit for trying to change your future. We know what it's like to have every door slammed in your face, no matter how hard you work or how sincere your repentance. Besides, Japheth added quietly, revenge is easy. Any fool with money and a grudge can destroy people. Building something better, that's hard. That requires vision, courage, and a willingness to be mocked by people like you who think compassion is weakness. We chose hard, Clayton. We chose to be the people we wish had existed when we needed help. Something flickered in Clayton's eyes. Not quite agreement, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. He left without another word, but Ruthie noticed he didn't slam the door. The next morning, the Arizona Gazette ran a front-page story. Railroad heir pleads for horse thief. Former outlaw advocates mercy in emotional courtroom speech. Within weeks, letters poured in from across the territory, from mothers of imprisoned sons, from former convicts trying to rebuild their lives, from ministers and reformers inspired by the Lutherman's vision. The Foundation's work had truly begun, and Ruthie understood now that their suffering hadn't been meaningless. Every humiliation, every door slammed in their faces, every moment of poverty and prejudice had been preparation for this. To be voices for those who had no voice, to be hope for those society had deemed hopeless. If you followed Ruthie and Japheth's journey this far, you've witnessed something extraordinary. How suffering can become purpose, how society's outcasts can become its greatest reformers, and how one person's belief in another can literally change the course of history. This is why we tell these stories, not just to entertain, but to remind you that your worst moments don't define you, that redemption is always possible, and that choosing compassion over revenge is the truest form of strength. Subscribe now to continue this journey with us, because Ruthie and Japheth's story isn't finished. The greatest test of their transformed lives is still ahead, and you won't want to miss how former enemies become unlikely allies, how a foundation becomes a movement, and how two people who lost everything gain something far more valuable than wealth. 1 year after their return to Prescott, the Lutherman's Second Chance Foundation officially opened its headquarters in a newly constructed building on the town's main street. The ceremony drew a crowd unlike any Prescott had ever seen. Territorial officials in formal attire standing alongside reformed convicts in their Sunday best, society ladies nervously positioned near former prostitutes from the women's home, prosperous ranch owners mixing with Mexican laborers and Native American traders. It was a cross-section of Arizona Territory humanity that had never gathered in one place before, and the tension was palpable. Silas Winters stood awkwardly near the back, his weathered hands gripping his hat. Over the past year, he'd slowly, painfully begun trying to rebuild a relationship with his daughter, not through grand gestures or hollow apologies, but through small, consistent efforts. He attended her charity events without complaint. He donated to the foundation, though far less than his wealth would allow. Most importantly, he begun actually listening when she spoke, treating her words as valuable rather than dismissible. The road to true reconciliation stretched long before them, and he'd barely taken the first steps, but at least he was walking. Coraline Hartford was present too, but in a different capacity than anyone would have predicted. She stood among the volunteers at the women's home, having had her own humbling experience when her husband's mercantile business failed spectacularly, leaving them briefly dependent on charity. The experience had cracked something open in her. She was learning, slowly and painfully, what Ruthie had always known, that circumstances change like desert weather, but character endures. As Ruthie stood to address the assembled crowd, she saw Jesse Callahan among the workers who had helped construct the building. Released early for exceptional behavior, now training as a carpenter and living proof that the Foundation's vision could work. She saw former members of various outlaw gangs learning to read in the Foundation's evening classes. She saw former prostitutes training in bookkeeping and accounting. She saw children of convicts attending school without shame, their slates and primers purchased by Foundation funds. This building stands for a simple principle, Ruthie declared, her voice clear and carrying across the crowded street. Every person has worth beyond their worst mistake. Every person deserves a chance to become who they're capable of being. And every person has the right to be judged by their present character, not their past circumstances or the accidents of their birth. Japheth stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. Together, they cut the ribbon. A former outlaw, and the woman who chose to believe in him when no one else would, now using the fortune recovered from his stolen childhood to redeem others from similar fates. The applause started slowly, almost tentatively, then built into something thunderous and genuine. It wasn't polite society applause. It was the sound of hope taking root in hard ground, of possibilities opening where none had existed before. Clayton watched from across the street, still not part of the celebration, but no longer actively opposing it. That Ruthie thought was progress. That evening, as the sun painted the Arizona sky in shades of orange and crimson, Japheth and Ruthie stood on the balcony of their Prescott home. Modest by their means, but comfortable and filled with books, photographs, and memories of their journey. Below them, the town was settling into its evening routine, lanterns flickering to life along the main street where their foundation building now stood as a permanent fixture. "Do you ever regret it?" Japheth asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders. "Standing on those courthouse steps, giving up everything you knew for a convict you barely understood?" Ruthie leaned into him, thinking of the sheltered girl she'd been. Uncertain, desperate to prove she was more than her father's disappointment, hungry for a purpose she couldn't name. She thought of the woman she'd become, strong, purposeful, transformed by suffering into something more resilient and compassionate than comfort ever could have forged. "Never," she said simply. "Not for a single moment. You taught me something my father's wealth never could. That true fortune isn't what you inherit, it's what you choose to do with what you're given. Even when what you're given is hardship." Japheth turned to face her, his weathered hands cupping her face gently. "I was lost, Ruthie. Completely lost. I didn't even know who I truly was. Kidnapped, raised by criminals, imprisoned for crimes I committed while trying to survive a life I never chose. You saw past all of that. You saw something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." "You were always worth saving," Ruthie replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Society just needed glasses." They laughed together, the sound carrying out over the town that had once rejected them. Down below, they could see people emerging from the foundation building, reformed convicts heading home to families, women from the home walking confidently toward evening jobs they'd secured, children carrying books they were learning to read. "Look at that," Japheth said, gesturing to the scene below. "A year ago, none of those people had hope. Now, they're building futures." "We're building futures," Ruthie corrected. "This isn't just our work anymore. It's become something bigger than us." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. It was Jesse Callahan, hat in hand, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. and Mrs. Lutherman, I wanted to thank you proper before the day ended," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Judge Crawford told me today that if I keep on like I've been doing, he'll consider a full pardon next year." "A full pardon? I never thought." His voice broke. "Mama says I should tell you that you gave her back her son. Not the one she lost to bad choices, but a better one." After Jesse left, Ruthie and Japheth returned to the balcony, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. 2 years after the foundation's opening, Ruthie stood in the garden behind their home, her hands resting gently on her swollen belly. Their first child would arrive before winter, and she found herself thinking about the legacy they would leave, not just of wealth, but of principles worth passing down. The foundation had expanded beyond anything they'd imagined. 3 more buildings now stood in Prescott, including a vocational school where former convicts learned blacksmithing, carpentry, and animal husbandry. The women's home had helped 42 women and 67 children establish independent lives. 17 men who'd passed through their program had gone on to start their own businesses, and not a single one had returned to crime. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in the shifting attitudes of Prescott itself. Shop owners who once refused service to former convicts now hired them. Families who once crossed streets to avoid those people now sent their children to learn alongside the foundation students. Even Clayton had quietly begun referring cases to the Foundation's legal aid program, though he'd never admit it publicly. Silas appeared at the garden gate, moving slowly with the stiffness of age and lingering regret. "Ruthie," he said softly, "may I walk with you?" They strolled among the vegetables and flowers in companionable silence. Their relationship would never be what it might have been if he'd chosen differently 3 years ago, but it had become something real, built on honest acknowledgement of past failures and genuine effort toward change. "I was wrong," Silas said finally, the words clearly difficult. "About Japheth, about you, about what matters in this life. I spent so many years valuing the wrong things. Reputation, wealth, what people thought. I lost 3 years with my daughter because I was too proud to see her wisdom. You're here now," Ruthie said, taking his weathered hand. "That's what matters." That evening, the Luthermans hosted a quiet dinner. Around their table sat an impossible gathering. Silas and Clayton, Jesse Callahan and his mother Clara, Detective Wade, who became a close friend, and Coraline Hartford, who now managed the women's home with unexpected competence and genuine compassion. As Japheth said grace over the meal, Ruthie looked at each face. People transformed by second chances, by the radical notion that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities. Later, as she and Japheth prepared for bed, he pulled her close. "We did it," he whispered. "We took the worst things that happened to us. My kidnapping, your rejection, our poverty, the prejudice, and we transformed it into something that helps others. We turned suffering into purpose. We're still doing it," Ruthie corrected, placing his hand on her belly where their child grew. "This is just the beginning. Our children will grow up knowing that people deserve to be judged by their character and their choices, not their circumstances or their past. They'll understand that true nobility comes from how you treat those who have nothing to offer you in return." Japheth kissed her forehead. "From outcasts to legacy builders. Who would have believed it?" "I did," Ruthie said simply. "I always did." Outside their window, Prescott settled into peaceful darkness. The Foundation building stood solid on the main street, its doors ready to open again tomorrow for people seeking second chances. The women's home sheltered families rebuilding their lives. The vocational school's forges would fire up at dawn, teaching useful trades to those society had written off. And in a modest home on the edge of town, two people who had lost everything and gained something far more valuable than wealth held each other close, grateful for the extraordinary journey that had transformed them from society's rejects into its most powerful advocates for redemption and change. The story of the disgraced rancher's daughter and the reformed outlaw had become legend throughout Arizona territory, not because of the dramatic revelation of hidden fortune, but because of what they chose to do with that fortune once it was recovered. They had proven that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or social position, but the courage to believe in redemption when everyone else has given up hope. And so we close this extraordinary chapter of Ruthie and Japheth's journey, a story that proves the most broken people often become the most powerful healers, and that choosing love over fear can literally transform an entire community. If this story has moved you, if you've seen yourself in Ruthie's courage to stand alone or Japheth's determination to become more than his past, then subscribe now to join our growing family of listeners who believe redemption is always possible. Ruthie chose to see worth where society saw only shame, and that single choice created ripples that changed hundreds of lives. Your subscription helps us share more stories of transformation, second chances, and the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people choose courage over comfort. Drop a comment telling us what this story meant to you and where you're tuning in from. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't define their future. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in the power of second chances. Until our next frontier tale, remember, you are always more than your worst moment, and your story isn't over yet.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it!